Hello everybody, welcome back to my C++ beginner tutorial. Today's part is part 15 and we're going to be covering multi-dimensional arrays. Yeah, complicated name. Multi-dimensional arrays are arrays with 2 dimensions. Now they can be 3 dimensions, but that's a little bit more complicated than I would like to discuss in a beginner tutorial series. Now, what we can say is a multi-dimensional array is kind of like a grid. And how we declare them is, let's create another constant int here. And we're going to call it number of grades. So this is how many grades we need. And say each student has 4 grades. Okay, well, what we can do here is, in our integer, we can create another opening and closing bracket, and we enter number of grades here. And that creates a 2-dimensional array. And the way 2-dimension works is, if you think of a graph, let's open up Paint or something. Okay, so we have a Paint program opened up here. Now we can think of a multi-dimensional array as a graph, a grid, X down here and Y going up, right? And each point of the array is a dot on that graph. And it creates, say it's 4 across and 50 up and down, it would be a 4 wide, 50 tall array. So it kind of, if you kind of get the picture, it'll create a big long list, and I can't really draw. Well, I don't have my Wacom tablet plugged in, so we can use something like this. It'll look something like this, all the way down to 50. Okay, so say that we want to access a certain variable in this multi-dimensional array, and say it's this variable here. Say we want to access this variable. Well, what we do is we count from the start, which is X, and then Y for number of grades. So say we want to access this variable, that's going to be 2. Actually, let's say this one because it's different. So we'll say 2, 3. So if we wanted to assign something to this, we would do the same thing as before with grades, but we would give it a 2 and then a 3 in the brackets. Does it make sense? So you can actually assign a very large amount of number in an array. Now, I'm going to show you how we can randomly fill up this array and call everything out for us and display it very nicely on the console screen. I'm going to bring down the number of students to 30. You know what, let's bring it down to 20, just to make it a little simpler to read on the console. Well, we need to create a random number for each grade and assign it to a value. So what we need to do is we need to do an embedded for loop. I think that's what they're called. Is we need to create another for loop inside of this for loop. So yeah, I know, right? And we'll just stick that there. Okay, well, this for loop is going to have an int. Let's create X here. So X, X, and X. Okay, so if it's less than students, then you will continue to run through the loop. Awesome. Well, this one is going to be int Y. So int Y equals 0. And if Y is less than the number of grades, then we will increment Y plus plus. Okay, pretty simple. Okay, so now we have 2 variables that will increment, and the way this will work is it'll run through this once, and it'll get to x equals 0, and then it'll run Y equals 0. So we need to create X. How am I going to do this? What's the easiest way to? So we'll say grades X, and then not X, and then Y. So the first pass will be X0, Y0, and then it'll loop this again first until it reaches number of grades. So then it'll do X0, Y1, X0, Y2, and it'll continue until it finally reaches y is less than the number of grades. Well, then it'll loop for again, and it'll say, okay, so x equals 1, and it'll do that process again, and then systematically filling out all of the grades. So now what we need to do is we need to read this to the screen, and we kind of need to format it a little better, right? So we can actually read what's going on. And we're going to do that by saying something like this. We're going to need to have a for loop again. So we'll say for int x equals 0, sorry, y equals 0, 0, when y is less than the number of students, yada yada. Y is equal less than the number of grades, sorry. Y plus plus. And we'll do the same thing here. X, X, and X. And then we'll create our opening and closing braces around this cout statement. So now what's going to happen is we're going to cout the X and then the Y part of this. Well, what happens here is that we don't want it necessarily to create a new line every grade, because then we can't read what's going on. So we need to remove the end line statement so that it creates it just prints the grades on the line with spaces in between them. So I'm just going to say something like this, like a tab, right? We've covered that before. So now once this is done running, that's when I'm going to say cout endl. So that's going to create a new line. So this will, again, do the same thing as this here, and it'll systematically read it all to the console with all the grades for the one student on and it going down. Best way to read this is to just press play, and you can see here that it has all the grades. It has 20 down, 4 across. So this student's grades is 14, 46, 53, and 11. This student's grades is 98, 49, 23, and 52. Pretty cool. Now, we could do something along the lines of actually having the user input something, right? So say we want to read the student's grades, but only a specific student. We don't want to see all of the students' grades at once. So we're just going to do this for loop here, and we're going to say for int I, and then that's the grades, and then we don't have an x value, so we need to create that. Let's say int x up here. So say int x. Well, we can't do that actually because there's already an int x there, so we need to say student, selected student, selected student. Okay. So let's say cout what student number are you wishing to see? Okay, so we'll say cn selected student. Okay, now what's going to happen is we just need to read selected student here. Awesome. Well, nope. So selected student. Okay. So now what we can do is we can run this program and visualize the selected student. So we'll get this prompt here. What student number are you wishing to see? We'll say I want to see student number 5. Okay? It'll show us student number 5. Pretty cool. Right? And it'll say press any key to continue. I can see the student number 5 got a 0 in that class. He must be horrible at whatever class that is. But he did get an 86% in whatever this class is. Well, now what happens when we try and, you know, enter something bigger than what we have room for? So say student number 25. Look what happens. This is kind of interesting. You can see a bunch of random numbers here as if there was something in that array. Well, how arrays work is they store data in your memory, more specifically your RAM memory, so this random access memory. and it just stores them until you change the value, and then it just changes the value in memory. Well, what happens when there's nothing to display there is it'll try and display it, but it's basically just reading a random part of memory within the computer, and it doesn't really know what to do with that. So you do need to make sure that you don't try and access bits of arrays that you're not trying to, because then you run into problems like this. And if it wasn't, it's easy to see on a console, but it's not so easy to see when you're, say, programming a game. So I know that tutorial was a little bit long. We covered multidimensional arrays in 10 minutes, so that's pretty good in my books. If you have any further questions, please leave them in the comments, because I know this can be a pretty complicated topic. But just imagine what you can do with this. You can do a lot of stuff with this. So keep watching. I'll see you next time.